We're going to talk today about very dramatic, violent, traumatic period in Indian history, which in a sense changed everything. And that is the Islamic invasion of India. So we're going to trace the history of the contact between India and the growing Islamic empire. It's something which has not ended. I think late last year there were terrorist attacks in Bombay. Was that at the end of last year? And it's still going on. So it began about 1,000 years ago, actually technically about 1,300 years ago, Muslim invasions of India. The violence actually has not stopped yet. And this tension between, just to put it crudely, Hindu India and India, of course, is not all Hindu, but at least there is one part of India which is certainly Hindu, the main part of it. So the conflict between Hindu India and violent Islamic people is still going on. It's still going on. And so we're going to trace that history and see the effect it had on India, on the religions of India, and so on. So the first contact, about 90 years after the new Muslim movement established its power in the Arabian Peninsula, there was an attack on a kingdom in what is called Sindh. It's now in Pakistan. It's the southern part of Pakistan. There was apparently a Brahmin king, a king who was technically born a Brahmin. And the story goes that a ship was trapped in a storm, and some of the survivors who were Muslims were arrested and taken to this king. And apparently, at least according to the Muslim version, were not treated in the nicest way. And so, whether this was a pretext or whatever it was, there were some... It's similar to, if you know the history of Europe at this time, there was sort of an excess of princes. There were too many princes, too many violent young princes, and they needed to be engaged. And so the Pope and other people had the great idea, why not just, rather than have them in Europe causing trouble and fighting battles all over the place, jousting and fighting for little principalities, send them to the Middle East, let them go on crusades, and let them, kill non-Christians. So, also there was actually this way of thinking. It was a very violent period. This, by the way, is before the Crusades, but the main invasions, at the same time the Christians are invading, Muslim lands. Muslims are also invading with no less violence Hindu lands, and so it's not the nicest period in history. There's a famous quote, of course, from the Pope, because when the Crusaders got to Jerusalem, they found that actually there were Christians, Jews, and Muslims living together in peace. And so they couldn't figure out who was who, so apparently the Pope said, we'll kill them all and let God sort them out. So anyway, so some prince, perhaps there were too many Muslim princes around at the time, and so one prince was sent to Sindh, and he conquered, he defeated the king of this Hindu kingdom, killed the king, and took over. But it sort of stopped there. So for some time there was a Muslim presence in this part, what is now Pakistan, but it kind of ended there. Then, another point we should mention, we really, it'd be nice we had a map here, but of course you have the Middle East, you have Baghdad, the Persian Gulf, the Arabian Sea. And just like if you look at, say, Christians today, some of them are extremely conservative and have extremely conservative views, some of them are very liberal. So in the Muslim world at the time, let's say now about 1,000 years ago, there were Muslims who were intellectually very sophisticated, philosophers, poets, Sufis were quite universalist in their outlook at times. So what I mean to say is there was a very sophisticated Islamic culture in great capitals like Baghdad. But at the same time, there was the boonies, so to speak. There were areas in Central Asia, sort of rough terrain, kind of wild, out of control people, semi-nomadic, raiders, pirates. There were very wild, violent parts of the Islamic world. And so it's not that Islam was a unified culture, and so as a unified culture they decided, let's go invade India. Rather, there were raids, extremely violent raids. Muhammad of Ghazni, who to this day in India is thought of as kind of a Hitler figure, just like in our culture, certain people stand out like Hitler as having been extraordinarily cruel and having killed a lot of people. So in Indian history, there are certain figures that stand out. One of them is Muhammad of Ghazni. I'm going to read some reports of what he actually did in India. It's it's quite violent. Anyway, meanwhile in India, like what's going on in India before these invasions? This invasion in 712 was kind of peripheral, didn't really affect almost everybody in India. In India, the Bhakti movements were very powerful. Hinduism had become, Buddhism had become very Hindu-like. The Bhakti movements tend to be egalitarian. There were new opportunities for women, for people born in so-called lower classes, because in the eye of God, everyone is equal. Everyone is equally a child of God. And so it had the same type of liberalizing effect that Jesus had actually at his time, sort of rejecting very materialistic and oppressive hierarchies and asserting the equality of all souls before God and establishing this new kind of ethic. So that was also going on in India. There were all kinds of things going on there. And so this Islam, what was Islam anyway? And we'll talk a bit about that. Founder of Islam, of course, is Muhammad. He was born apparently in 570 and died in 632. Those are the official dates. We won't go into the whole history, but he was sort of a humble guy from a respectable family. He was an orphan, and he had to earn his keep going on caravans. And at one point, he had what he felt was a revelation, and apparently he felt that God was speaking through the angel Gabriel to him. So it comes from God through Gabriel to Muhammad, and he writes down this revelation, which is the Quran. And so without going into the whole history, Islam basically, very early on, they established 5 basic principles. That you have to do 5 things to be a Muslim. One is the profession of faith. In Arabic, it's something like La ilaha. What does anyone know that? Yeah, go ahead. Yes, that there's no God but God, there's no God but God, right? And Muhammad is his prophet, is that right? Yeah. And so you have to say that and really mean it. So if you say that and you really mean it, then you are professing yourself to be a Muslim. The second thing was to offer prayers 5 times a day, early morning, mid-morning, noon, mid-afternoon, and evening. Charity, giving alms, and fasting during the holy month of Ramadan, and other austerities, such as the restraint of smoking and drinking. And then finally, will he make it to the end of the class? I really want to make it through all these atrocities that I have planned for you. And then there's the, I know it's sort of like summer blockbusters. And then the pilgrimage to Mecca. The pilgrimage to Mecca. So of course, there are endless debates about Islam, whether it was intrinsically violent, or whether that was simply a response to certain historical circumstances, whether the Prophet himself encouraged violence, or was sort of enthusiastic about it, or whether he also was just responding to circumstances, and whether Islam is really ultimately a religion of peace. And of course, these debates go on a lot nowadays, and I'm certainly not going to take a position on that. What is a historical fact is that very early on, the Islamic community defined itself or asserted itself in acts of war. And again, I'm not judging whether these wars were, justified or not justified, but they happened. And first, the new Islamic community took over the city of Medina. Muhammad himself acted as a general, and then they marched on Mecca, and eventually took over Mecca. And so by these military campaigns, they took over the Arabian Peninsula, and then in one of the most dramatic, explosive military expansions, really in history, this early Islamic community began to march on many other, in a sense, much more sophisticated cultures like the Mesopotamian culture, which compared to the somewhat nomadic, polytheistic desert culture of the Arabian Peninsula, the culture in Mesopotamia, which had, in the past, went under the name of the Babylonian culture, and before that, the Sumerians. So there had been actually thousands of years of sophisticated culture in Mesopotamia. Mesopotamia means between the rivers. Potamos in Greek means river, and Meso, between. So the land between the Tigris and Euphrates. These great river civilizations, like in Egypt along the Nile, along the Tigris and Euphrates. So as the fact that we don't hear about this incredible military and religious expansion of Islam says something about the nature of our Western curriculum. We hear about Napoleon and Alexander and so on, but no less impressive militarily was this Islamic expansion. So with the conquering of much more culturally sophisticated civilizations, Islam itself became much more sophisticated, and it set up its capital in Baghdad, which was a culturally sophisticated city. And so, anyway, as this expansion is going on, again, 90 years, really just 80. I can still do math at my age. 80 years after the death of Muhammad, they've already conquered this little Sin kingdom in India. It wasn't called India then, but part of the Indian culture. And then by about 1000, Muhammad of Ghazni, who was really a pirate and one of the most brutal, raiders in history. So we'll read about him. He came down, and again, he's coming into a civilization. He's coming down into a civilization which is certainly, compared to almost any other part of the world, very liberal, tolerant, multicultural. There's freedom of speech. There's freedom of religion. There's been these freedoms actually for thousands and thousands of years. It's almost, I don't want to say decadently liberal, although that always is a tendency, but it is it has its decadent side. Not that most people were decadent, but the Tantra tradition is going on. So it's sort of a free, liberal, and at some of the margins, decadent, very sophisticated civilization. And suddenly this guy, Muhammad of Ghazni, who's not coming from Baghdad, he's coming from Central Asia, and he's somewhat of a barbarian. He's Muslim, but he's not the philosophical Muslim type. He's not the Baghdad is kind of like the Paris of the Muslim world, so he's not a sophisticated guy. He's you'll see for yourself what he was like. If I can find this now. So here, now in our book, it's interesting because, just so you can do a little comparative study yourself, the book that we're reading by Professor Rodriguez, in this little section, Islam in India, a brief history that you all read very carefully and practically memorized, it's he gives he tries to, how should I put it, sort of in the real spirit of Western liberal academics, he tries to soften the picture of Islam by saying things such as, it may be misleading, which means it may not be misleading, to characterize the Muslim, the region of this empire, talking about under the Muslims, as under Muslim or Islamic rule, because the ruling styles of the Hindu and Muslim kingdoms of those states were fairly similar. In other words, it wasn't really a Muslim theocracy, it wasn't really a Muslim tyranny, because the Muslims and Hindus tended to rule and govern in many of the same ways. They set the same types of political and bureaucratic structures and so on and so forth. It's not exactly like that, because it was often the case, not always, but often the case, and under Islamic rule, there was not freedom of religion. There were penalties for not belonging to the right religion. And so again, this is the Western academic tradition trying to soften the image that something really bad happened. But we'll see later, Rodriguez himself will admit that actually really bad things did happen. So furthermore, this, what may be misleading, conveys the sense that obligatory mass conversions to Islam had occurred, which current historical analyses reject. And then it seems that conversions were often driven by desires for upward mobility through intermarriage. In other words, there were not coercive conversions. It's just that you had no upward mobility. You couldn't get anywhere in life unless you converted. So, I mean, this is obviously the point I'm trying to make, I'll be very explicit, is that this is very much a sanitized and to some extent distorted view. And to show you where this is coming from, because nowadays in India, and I certainly don't believe in original sin, and I don't believe that the Muslims who now live in India are in any way responsible for what happened earlier. But there is a tremendous amount of hostility and tension still in India, and at times Hindus have persecuted Muslims in India. That has also happened at times. And so the Western academic liberal community has very much jumped in on the side of the Muslims, seen the Hindus as sort of the villains in all of this, seen the Hindus as the villains in all this, and that they have to defend the minority group from the Hindus. And because there are the Hindus that tend to be angry at Muslims still, they tend to want to reestablish a type of Hindustan, a more Hindu republic in India. So also the Western academics fighting for secularism see these Hindus as almost evil, and therefore the good guys are the Muslim underdogs. Now, I'm not, again, taking a position on this. I'm not saying who's right and wrong, but it's very much a fact, because a few decades ago, there was a huge uproar when some Hindus wanted to take back what they claimed historically was the birthplace of Lord Rama. And the Christians, both Christians and Muslims, had a policy that when they took over a country that had the wrong religion, they would destroy the sacred places of that religion and convert them into, and then build a church or a mosque in the same place. Or just turn the pagan shrine into you can see this in Mexico City, for example, where in the Zocalo, in the center of Mexico City, which was where the Aztecs had their sacred places and stuff like that, they, of course, destroyed all that and built huge churches and cathedrals. And, yes?
You know, some of the mosques are actually built. You can see parts of Hindu temple. Some of the bricks are like sculpted in Hindu style. And actually.
Yeah, there's all kinds of archaeological evidence. So for example, if you go to Mathura in India, just below Delhi, and go to the place where Krishna is said to have been born, where the tradition claims that Krishna was born, what you will find there is not the temple that used to be at Krishna's birthplace. You'll find a mosque. Because they destroyed the temple that was built to Krishna at his birthplace and built a mosque. So similarly, there used to be a temple in India, in Ayodhya, where, according to Hindu tradition, Rama was born, and what you now find there is a mosque. So, just to give you a little bit of history. When India gained independence, Nehru became the prime minister, and of course then his daughter, Indira Gandhi, and so on, and they still kind of rule. They're still very much political rulers in India. What happened is that they put together this coalition, which included, which was almost anti-Hindu pro-secular, pro-Muslim, because they wanted to put together this, patch together this coalition. And they did that. And so the early Congress government, that was the government, the first government to take power after independence, really, in a sense, kind of put down Hinduism. So much so that finally there was a backlash, there was a big reaction, and the Congress was thrown out of power, and a pro-Hindu party came into power. Now Congress is back in power, but it goes back and forth like this. So all these tensions are there. And the description in our textbook is very much coming out of all of that. I mean, it's not stated explicitly, but if you know the whole history, the involvement of the anyway, so when the Hindus wanted to, when the pro-Hindu party took power in India, and there was a movement to take back Ram Janmabhoomi, the land of Ram's birth, and they felt they had very solid scholarly evidence to prove that this was originally a temple that had been desecrated or taken over and turned into a mosque. So they stormed this mosque and they took it over. And then the Indian government sent in the army and kicked out these people, and they just kind of barricaded it in, and now it's kind of like a no man's land. You can't go there. But what's interesting is that when all this was going on, the Western academic establishment came down heavily and aggressively and passionately against the Hindus, because they felt that the Hindus were threatening Western-type secularism. And anyway, so again, who's right and wrong is not for me to say in a public university. However, so there's been a backlash so against this drive for sort of a more pro-Hindu. I mean, to give an example, in India, where there's a relatively tiny minority of Christians, Christmas is a national holiday, but the birthday of Krishna is not, and the birthday of Ram is not. So, in other words, the traditional holiest days of Hinduism are not national holidays, but Christmas is a national holiday. And I remember one time, actually in 1970, oh my God, 79, when I was 9 years old. Anyway, in 1979, I happened to be in Bombay, and I was having lunch with a lady who at that time was the chief minister, which is like the governor of Goa. Governor of Goa. So we were having lunch together, and she was in the Congress party, and she admitted to me off the record, because she knew everything, because she sort of grown up with the Congress party, that when Nehru took power, he sent out a private, off-the-record memo to all government workers saying that no government worker should ever be seen going to a Hindu temple. And so they had this very aggressive, almost, anyway, there were backlashes against it, and Congress reinvented itself, and all this going on in India. It's highly politicized, but so as part of the Western academic jumping into the fray on the side of the Muslims against the Hindus, which they very much did, there's been all these attempts to reinvent Indian history and to play down all the violence and the brutality and to come out with a much more pleasant picture of the role of Islam in India. And this is really very much behind what you read in your book, if you actually read it. So, no one here really just scans over it and answers the questions, right? When you all sit down under a tree and bond with the reading. So, anyway, so we have things like that we shouldn't think there were obligatory mass conversions. So in other words, but then he says, no, rather people converted voluntarily because otherwise you couldn't get a good job, which is completely voluntary, right? So if you're in other words, there was no force, it's just that you couldn't get a good job unless you converted. So this is in the same paragraph, by the way. What else? Historians also reject a prevailing popular view of systematic wholesale destruction of non-Muslim holy places, such as Buddhist monasteries and Hindu temples. And then what's the next sentence? Well, some such places were definitely sacked for their wealth, and many religious centers were destroyed. I'm not making this up. And many religious places, many religious centers were destroyed by zealous Muslim rulers, such as Firuz Tukluk, 14th century. Islam and non-Islamic spiritual and philosophical life generally coexisted and interacted peacefully, although many religious centers were destroyed. But in general, it was very peaceful. It's interesting because, I mean, if you study the nature, the psychology, and the sociology of tyranny, once you terrorize and brutalize the people, you don't have to keep doing that because everyone knows their place. You kill enough people, you torture enough people, you destroy enough sacred places, and in other words, you terrorize people enough, and you don't have to keep doing it because you've already kind of crushed them. You've crushed their spirit, and so the idea that it was generally peaceful, it's just that many religious... I mean, Buddhism, practically, the Muslims had a policy of simply killing Buddhist monks. And interestingly, Buddhism had produced great universities, really in a modern Western sense, almost more American than European, because European universities came out of the Middle Ages. Have you ever seen like medieval cities in Europe? I mean, you can go to these old medieval, like in Italy or other places, medieval cities behind walls, on top of hills, because they're afraid of the Vikings and afraid of all these different invaders and Muslims. And there's literally not a blade of grass in these old medieval cities. I mean, like in America, we have parks and lawns, and people like to have their house under the shade of a tree. These old medieval cities, literally, it's just like the streets are this narrow, and there's hardly one green living thing in the whole town. And of course, there's farms all around there, but if you have to like flee back into your city and close the gates and everything, there's just these. It's very interesting to see what kind of cities they built in the Middle Ages. But in America, we have these like University of Florida, these wide campuses, sort of like in a park-like setting, and that's what they had in India, in Nalanda. The Buddhists, long before the first universities in Europe, had these beautiful campuses. These beautiful campuses. They taught all kinds of different subjects. They even taught different religions. It's just like nowadays. There are many, like if you say you go to Georgetown University, it's a Catholic university, but it's liberal, and they teach all the religions. It's not like a fanatical place. It's Georgetown, and so on. So in the same way, you have these Buddhist universities. They're actually quite liberal, taught different religions, beautiful campuses. And the Muslim contribution to this was to basically destroy it and turn it into rubble, and to kill the professors and students they get their hands on. But this is not to say that, anyway. So, again, this is no reflection on anyone today. It's just what happened historically. I'll just read a few descriptions, because it was actually a very traumatic series of events. And it did forever, I think it forever changed, or was maybe melodramatic. It certainly did change for a long time, the whole psychology, the whole national character of the Indian people. Just like there's PTSD, you know PTSD, right? Post-traumatic stress disorder. That if someone, let's say, has a traumatic experience, like you see a loved one being killed, or you've been in combat or something like that, then post-traumatic, after the trauma's over, you still have this stress disorder. And PTSD can happen at a societal level, at a collective level. I mean, you go into that. I mean, anyway, I won't go into it here. But the whole Western scientific attitude toward religion, I think, is a reflection of that post-traumatic attitude. Symptoms of which are hyper vigilance and withdrawal. But anyway, so here's Muhammad of Ghazni. And now this is a book written by an Indian historian. A history book who teaches at UCLA. So he's sort of a mainstream professor. And so what we have in our book was sort of more of a liberal Western view. Here is from a scholar who teaches at UCLA, but who's from India. and who's a Hindu Indian. And so here's his take on it. What followed with Muhammad of Ghazni was a period of extremely violent contact between Islam and India. The objective of the invaders was plundering, looting, wanton destruction, and death. Muhammad of Ghazni has remained in Indian history the epitome of cruelty and barbarism. He invaded India 17 times between 1000 and 1026, and he goes into it. Somnath in Gujarat, there was a beautiful Somnath temple. In fact, it's even said that it was one of the wonders of the world. It had all kinds of, they even said they had a deity suspended in midair through magnets and everything. It was an architectural and even technological wonder of its time. Somnath was a celebrated city of India. This is an Arab contemporary. Here is a report about Muhammad of Ghazni's attack on the Somnath temple, written by an Arab contemporary. It was not written by an Indian. Somnath was a celebrated city of India situated on the shore of the sea and washed by its waves. Among the wonders of that place was the idol, the deity, in the middle of the temple without anything to support it from below or to suspend it from above. It was held in the highest honor among the Hindus, and whoever beheld it floating in the air was struck with amazement, whether he was a Muslim or an infidel. The Hindus would go on a pilgrimage there whenever there was an eclipse of the moon, and would assemble there to the number of more than 100,000. The ebb and flow of the tide, it was on the coast, was considered to be the worship paid to the idol by the sea. Everything of the most precious was brought there as offerings, and the temple was endowed with more than 10,000 villages. That means that a village, of course, had to pay taxes to a king. And so a king would give villages to a temple, meaning that the tax revenue from those villages would go to maintain the temple. That was also done in Christian and Muslim places. The edifice was built upon 56 pillars of teak wood covered with lead. Near the idol was a chain of gold weighing 200 mans, whatever that was. The Sultan, Muhammad of Ghazni, arrived there in December of 1025. The Indians made a desperate resistance. The numbers of slain exceeded 50,000. The Sultan gave orders for the seizing of the spoil. So, now here's another quote from Al-Biruni. Al-Biruni was a Muslim who came with Muhammad. He was a chronicler. He was a scholar, a serious scholar, who worked for Muhammad of Ghazni. And this is what he said. This is Al-Biruni speaking about his master. Muhammad utterly ruined the prosperity of the country. It's interesting because there's this idea of India like being a poor country. Of course, that's not so much the image now because the economy is growing so quickly. But again, we're talking about what was very likely the richest country in the world before this invasion, before this series of invasions. And so Al-Biruni, again, Muhammad of Ghazni's personal chronicler, said, Muhammad utterly ruined the prosperity of the country, which he thought was good, and performed those wonderful exploits by which the Hindus became like atoms of dust scattered in all directions. Their scattered remains cherish, of course, the most inveterate aversion toward all Muslims. This is the reason, too, why the Hindu sciences have retired far away from parts of the country conquered by us and have fled to places which our hand cannot yet reach. To Kashmir, Benares, and other places. In other words, education was devastated, science was devastated, the economy was ruined. That's what happened. That's Al-Biruni. I just want to read one more. I don't want to go on too much with all this, but so from 1208, at first there were just raids, stealing, looting, killing, all those good things. And then by 1208, they actually established a sort of a political dominance of Muslims in Delhi. It was called the Delhi Sultanate. It lasted until 1526. In 1520, and during that time, I don't think a single Muslim ruler ever died in his sleep. Basically, it was a series of assassinations and political intrigue. It's because there were many different Islamic groups. Another very important thing that happened, I'm going to read about the destruction of Vijayanagar. which is another very dramatic incident. In the middle of the 1200s, something very important happened outside of India, which changed the world, and that is that the Huns, as in Attila, the Huns invaded and destroyed Baghdad. Baghdad was the center of this very powerful Islam. Now, up until the destruction of Baghdad and the sack of Baghdad, which was, talk about karma. Anyway, it was a horrific. The Huns were very competitive when it came to brutality. And so, up to that time, the people who invaded India, the Muslims who invaded India, still identified with their Caliph. The Muslim world was sort of under the authority of the Caliph in Baghdad. And, to what extent the Caliph in Baghdad had real control, but at least there was this official ceremonial thing. And so the Muslims that came to India and wielded power there saw themselves as serving the Caliph, as working within this great Islamic empire. And they would even go back to their original place. They would invade India, leave someone there to represent them, and just go back to their own countries. And if they needed help, Baghdad would send reinforcements. With the collapse of Baghdad, with the destruction of Baghdad by the Huns, the Muslims in India were on their own. They were on their own. And they could not expect reinforcements. And so, to some extent, it meant they really became Indians. They really became Indians. They began to identify much more with India, and that had all kinds of consequences. So that was a major thing. And so next, on Friday, we're going to talk about the Mughals, the Mughal Empire, and what happened with them. That's an amazing story in itself. The Mughals were, they were a completely different group of people. Anyway, Vijayanagar was this town, this city, Hindu kingdom. Vijayanagar means the victory city. Founded in 1347, it lasted 150 or 200 years, and it was kind of one of the wonders of the world. There was if I can find this quote. It was a very rich city, and where'd the thing go? It was a very rich city, and liberal, had people from all around the world. It said even the common people. Okay, here it is. Here's some quotes. According to Niccolo Conti, an Italian traveler, in 1420, the circumference of Vijayanagar was 60 miles around. Its 7-mile walls extending up to the mountains and enclosing the valleys at their foot. Domingo Paes, a Portuguese visitor, recorded the following. In this city you will find men belonging to every nation and people, because of the great trade which it has, and the many precious stones there, principally diamonds. This is the best provided city in the world. Its riches were phenomenal. Abdur Razak, a Persian traveler, 1442 to 43, wrote of the emperor's treasury having, quote, chambers with excavations in them filled with molten gold, forming one mass. Apparently the wealth had trickled down to common people because Razak adds all the inhabitants of the country, whether high or low, even down to the artificers of the bazaar, wear jewels and gilt ornaments in their ears and around their necks, arms, wrists, and fingers. So even the lowest people have jewels and gold on their bodies. So, a coalition of 5 little Islamic kingdoms finally conquered this Vijayanagar. And so here's a description. This is from a book by Robert Sewell, a book called The Forgotten Empire of Vijayanagar. The third day saw the beginning of the end. The enemy, the Muslim invaders, had come to destroy, and they carried out their object relentlessly. They slaughtered the people without mercy, broke down the temples and palaces, and wreaked such savage vengeance on the abode of the kings that with the exception of a few great stone-built temples and walls, Nothing more remains but a heap of ruins to mark the spot where once the stately buildings stood. With fire and sword, with crowbars and axes, they carried on day after day their work of destruction. Never perhaps in the history of the world has such havoc been wrought, and wrought so suddenly on so splendid a city, teeming with a wealthy and industrious population in the full plenitude of prosperity one day, and on the next seized, pillaged, and reduced to ruins amid scenes of savage massacre and horror beggaring description. So, if we compare this to the description of Megasthenes, the Greek ambassador, about 2,300 years ago, who says that India is very prosperous, among other reasons, because when there's war, no one will ever attack an innocent person. No one will ever attack anyone's property. That farmers can plow their fields with complete security, when down the road a battle's going on. If you think about a tradition where the Emperor Ashoka sent ministers around, not ministers, but government agents, to make sure that no human being or animal was being mistreated. And so it's not that India was a utopia, it's not that everything was idealistic, ideal all the time, but if you consider what had come before, the fact that Buddhism, this religion, Buddhism, could actually arise in India and openly decry the sacred literatures of the Vedic culture, openly say that they're all wrong, there is no soul, there's no God, the Vedas are all wrong. And no one fights a war over it. They just debate it. They just have arguments about it. Buddhism has spread, Jainism has spread. I mean, there are the odd cases, the exceptions where one king got out of control, but in general, there were not religious wars. Suddenly, you have these people coming into India, a Middle Eastern tradition, again, is about the same time as the Crusades. And so to say that this was traumatic for India, I think, is really a gross understatement. And so what happened to India? I mean, what was the psychological, the religious, the political, the social result of all this? So we'll talk about that more. Do you have more time? On Friday. But so any questions so far on this? Now, one thing I should point out is not that all the Muslims were bad. There were actually some real Muslim saints. There were Sufi groups who you could say were, by any normal definition, were actually saints and spiritual persons. There were Muslims who sincerely respected Hinduism. There were Hindus and Muslims that became friends, that intermarried out of love and not simply for other reasons. So it's not that everyone was bad, but a lot of extremely violent, traumatic things happened that had really not happened before in that part of the world. And I think it's not really possible to understand India today without understanding that all these things really did happen and are still very much in the minds of people in India. So we'll continue on Friday.